Hello, booktube. I'm Shawn, Breathes Books. Welcome back to my channel and a really special conversation about a very special work of literature. I am joined today by Lindy of Lindy's Magpie Reads. Hello, Lindy.
Hello there.
And we are aficionados. We are big fans of the writing of Douglas Bruton, who is joining us today from his home in the Scottish borders and to discuss his, good Lord, it's penultimate novel, but knowing him, he's had seven more published since I last talked to him. But this novel came out in 2024. It is called Hope Never New Horizon. And we have read it, and we're here to discuss it with Douglas Bruton. Welcome, Douglas.
Thank you very much for having me again, Shawn. I'm really excited to be here.
I can't wait to pick that big, soulful brain of yours about this incredibly intelligent and soulful novel. I just loved it. So my job is to not gush overly, but believe me, if I don't gush overly, it's because I'm working very hard not to do so. Do you have a sentence or two about your thoughts of the book before we ask Douglas to introduce it? Lindy.
I loved it. I could gush. Hope is something that we can all use these days, and there's a lot
Abs-
of it in this book.
Absolutely. And I remember some of Douglas's comments at the end of our last chat about what gave rise to this book, the social political moment. So we'll probably dig into that as well. This conversation will be spoiler free at the beginning, and then quite possibly later, we will move into spoiler territory, and you will be amply warned when we're about to do so, and you can govern yourselves accordingly. Douglas, give us a little introduction to Hope Never Knew Horizon.
So the book, as you referred to there, came about because I was in despair, if you like, during the middle of lockdown, when lockdown was at its darkest and there was no foreseeable light in the future. And our world was going to be changed. And I woke up one morning and decided that I wanted to write something with hope in it. I didn't want to write a book about the pandemic. I wanted to get away from the pandemic as much as possible. I thought there'd be lots of books about the pandemic anyway. So I wanted to write something that had hope in it. And having voiced that almost to the universe, hopeful stories started arriving and assaulting me, if you like. And this book has three threads and three separate stories, which I hope by telling them mixed in with each other, vibrate like a kind of string on a musical instrument against each other and set each other off and link with each other in kind of emotional ways rather than anything more direct than that. And the three threads are, first of all, there's a woman called Ada Alice Pullen, who was the model for a painting called Hope, painted by George Frederick Watts. And that's one thread. The second thread is to do with Emily Dickinson, more specifically to do with her maid and her maid's perception of what's going on in the Dickinson household. And the third thread is to do with the renovation of the bones, the skeleton of the blue whale. So it's in fact the whole story of this third thread is to do with the blue whale skeleton that hangs in the Natural History Museum in London. And I'm going to start by reading a bit from the book, which has to do with this blue whale. So in the blue whale thread, we follow its journey from when the whale landed on a sandbank and couldn't get off and died there, and then was sold, and then the carcass was cleaned and all the bones sent across to London. And then the plan was to hang the whale skeleton in a great place in this museum, but they didn't have a space big enough. And so until they could get the money together, they boxed up the whale and put it into storage within the museum. And so I'm going to read a piece which involves a museum assistant who goes into the storage place and has some kind of relationship with the whale, with the dead whale, with the skeleton of the whale, which is boxed up in these big storage boxes. And there's lots of facts or truth bits in this novel, but this bit is entirely fiction. And I like that. But I also like that I'm playing and letting you know I'm having fun here and I'm playing. So I tell you, for example, that I don't know the name of the museum assistant. So I know the story, but I don't know his name. And it's almost like he never existed at all, is what I say. And that's because he didn't exist at all. So I'm having a kind of joke and a play, and I do the same with the woman. Anyway, so I'll read. There was a museum assistant who worked there, but his name is lost to the story, so that it is as though he never existed at all. He was a smaller man than the others already named, and in truth, he had no part to play in the story of the whale. He read about its arrival in Kensington in his newspaper, and it was specifically this that prompted him to apply for a post in the museum sometime that same year, the year that the blue whale was boxed up and stored out of sight. Out of sight is not necessarily out of mind, for there continued to be discussions down the years on how best to display the whale bones, and calculations made on the cost and how it might be managed, and drawings commissioned for a space grand enough to be home to the whale skeleton. And this nameless museum assistant, he kept a scrapbook of all that pertained to the whale each time it was mentioned in the newspapers, the minutes of meetings where it was discussed, and the photographs that leaked out, which documented the journey from Ireland to Bristol and then to London and Kensington, and scribbled copies of the architect's drawings that changed from one year to the next. Then at night, when all the city slept, and this same museum assistant was charged with checking that the windows and doors were everywhere locked, and no one was loitering in the corridors, and the floors had been swept, and all was quiet and still in the museum, he stole to the back of the building where the public were not to enter, and he walked among the storage boxes, and his breath was held, and he listened with a sharp ear. Sharp as a butcher's knife, he'd have said, for his father had been a butcher. And he went in search of those boxes that held the bones of the blue whale. And when he found them, he put his ear to the boxes, pressed hard so he could hear the smallest sound inside. Do not think for a moment that the bones in those boxes sat quiet and still. They shifted sometimes and settled and shifted again, restless in their dry, dark nests. And there was always a sound that clung to them, stubborn and unshakable. And if you asked that museum assistant what that sound was, he would shrug and say it was like the shushing of the sea, the same that you hear when holding a seashell to the ear. And it was the kick and kick of water, and a moaning sound like music that is wayward and wordless and wild. It was not known then that whales sing, and that their magnificent songs carry across oceans, hopeful and full of yearning. But when that museum assistant wrote in his blue whale scrapbook, he made a record of what he heard, and he described it as whale song. And when he was lying in his bed and in his own darkness, which was not box darkness, but street-light darkness, and not really dark at all, he imagined he heard that whale song still, ringing in his ears. He told only one other person, and she asked if she could hear it too. Her name is also lost, but she was real enough for this story. And he told her where to hide in the museum, so that come closing time, she would not be found. Then, when the lights were extinguished, and he was doing his rounds, checking the windows and doors, picking up discarded tickets and sweet wrappers, he collected that young woman, and hand in hand, they went to the storage room, and straight to the boxes where the whale skeleton was stored. Maybe they kissed. That is to be expected, and so I do not make much of it here. And he showed her how to press her cheek and her ear to one box after another, and to hold her breath and her heartbeats so she could better hear. And after, she said it was a wonder, and she promised she'd heard it too. And there, in the dark of the storeroom, she sang the same song back to the boxed whale, like an answer to its song, like a litany prayer sung in church. Do not ask me how I know this story and yet do not know the names of the museum assistant or the young woman. I can say only that I too have heard the whale bones singing, for the song never ends, but rings down the ages. all you have to do is listen.
You selected my favorite passage from the book, Douglas. Well done.
Oh, thank you. It's one I like too. I have a fondness for blue whales. I remember as a teenager in the 70s, I used to wear a jacket, and on the jacket was a pin badge, and it was to do with the whale. And the pin badge had the picture of a whale and a rainbow above it. And so rainbows being symbolic of hope, it seems fitting that I ended up writing this book.
And whale song is a very hopeful song too, in the sense that whales are communicating over vast distances. I saw an IMAX movie about blue whales. Oh, just, they're such astonishing mammals. Wow. Yeah.
Yes, I'm an ESL teacher, and for one of my reading classes, I taught a news article that was quite recent about whale song, and I forget which type of whales, but that they were doing synchronized swimming and they were 100 kilometers apart. And so the whale song, the whale sound that they were transmitting seemed to be how they choreographed, which was
Wow.
absolutely fascinating. That passage that you read is what pulled me deep inside this book, and I never came out until a few hours ago when I finished the last 40 pages. And I actually turned on a whale song audio thing on YouTube for the last 30 pages, and that was a wonderful way to finish. The three strands, the three parts of this story are very different. Can you, maybe you don't want to, and if you don't want to, I would totally understand, but if you would share with us how you chose, or how these three stories came to you in a way where you felt a resonance between them to make a work of fiction, including all three. I'm fascinated by that part of your creative brain.
I have to say, I'm not completely in tune with what my brain does, and I don't completely understand it. I'm able afterwards to analyze what I've done and what I've produced and understand it a little bit better from that analysis. But at the time I was thinking about this as an idea, I wanted to write hope, something with hope in it, and I wanted it filled up with hope. And I've expressed that. Well, the very next day, I overheard two people online talking about a TV program they'd seen, which was about the taking down of the blue whale skeleton and the cleaning of it and the renovating of it, and then the rehanging of it in the Hints Hall at the Natural History Museum. And they gave it a name. They named the whale, and I thought, wow, that name fits with what I want to write. And that story sounded so magical. And as I said already, I had a kind of affinity for whales, so it just slotted in. And then I remembered the Emily Dickinson poem, Hope is a Thing with Feathers, which most people know about. And I thought, well, there must be a story there. And I have these moments where I say, oh, there must be a story there. And invariably, I discover that there is. And the very next day, on my Facebook feed, there was an advert for a book. And the book was the collection, or a collection, of the letters of Emily Dickinson to a woman called Susan Huntington. And there was a suggestion that there might have been a relationship that was more than just sister-in-law. There might have been a relationship that was more romantic and more erotic even. And scholars are divided on that. So I thought, oh, there's a story there. I need to get in and find out a bit more about this. And then I remembered age 20. And now, age 20, I was a very uncultured young man. Books were barely part of my life. I was studying a degree in English literature, but I was way behind everybody else. I hadn't read anything. And my English teacher had said I should go to university and study literature, so that's why I was doing it. I happened to find myself in London, and I suppose I thought, what do students do? And I thought students go to art events. So I thought, I'll go to the Tate. At that time, there was only one Tate gallery in London. It was just called the Tate. And now it's called Tate Britain, so that you can differentiate it from Tate Modern. And so I went along to the Tate Gallery, and I didn't know anything about it. It was only the second visit to an art gallery that I'd ever had. And the previous one had been a school trip. So this was me launching out. And I knew nothing about art, nothing at all. And I wandered around aimlessly, not understanding what I was seeing. And suddenly I was confronted by this painting called Hope by George Frederick Watts. And out of all the paintings in the gallery, this is the one that stopped me short and held me. And I was held for 15, 20 minutes, nearly half an hour, just looking at this painting. And my mouth was probably quite slack and I was wide-eyed, and it just stayed with me. And so thinking about writing a book about hope, this painting came back to me and I thought, oh, I wonder who the model was for this painting. You must be able to find out. Now, sometimes my musts don't bear any fruit, so there must be this or there must be that, and it turns out there's not. But in this case, a quick sort of troll around the computer, the internet, and I found out about a woman called Ada Alice Pullen, and her story was just so interesting and so fascinating and so rich that I felt I could use this and I could do something about hope. And in terms of what the novel was actually going to be about, apart from that sort of woolly term hope, I had no idea. I launched into writing without even having fully finished the research. And I just kept going, and the stories just kept bouncing along and other things would come up in them. And that's the creative subconscious. That's the part of my brain that I don't fully understand, but I do fully trust. And I just knew it was going to lead me to a proper conclusion. I did not plan the book, so it looks planned because there are 10 chapters for each of the 3 stories, so there are 30 chapters, and they all end at just the right time. So it looks like I'm building something but actually the building is happening just as I go along and not following any kind of route. Does that make sense?
Wow, it's great to hear more about how that came together. In that passage that you read, Douglas, there were a couple of things that I would say are reasons why I love to read your work. The turns of phrase that you include in that passage, it was sharp as a butcher's knife. So not just sharp as a knife, but as a butcher's knife. And I was thinking about other phrases that caught my ear in other parts of the book, like early doors comes up a couple of times.
Oh, yes, yes, yes.
Not an expression I'd heard before.
No.
And I'm always delighted when I find something new in language or vocabulary. But another thing that was in that passage you read was talking about the kick of the waves. And I can think of a couple of other places in the book where kick is used in a way that's not with the foot.
Yes.
There is
The storytelling teacher.
the pen kick. Oh, yes. And the teacher, Mr. Boland, and describing his voice as dancing and kicking.
Yes.
And the flourish of the pen, Emily's pen, the pen kick. I love stuff like that. I love language. Yeah.
I'm so glad you brought that up. I marked that passage with the teacher.
I love language. I was an English teacher for much of my working life, and so I absolutely love language. I don't set out writing to try and be poetical, but it just flows out. I don't do much in the way of editing at all. And so this book that you've read, that's pretty much as I wrote it. Very few changes were made after I completed the manuscript. And the manuscript was completed in 6 days. And uncharacteristically, I had an interruption, actually. So normally I'm sitting there and I'm intense for 6 days and I'm focused. And I have the thought in my head of what the book's going to be, and it's to do with hope. And so all the language ends up being positive, like the kicking and the dancing. It just is influenced by my thought that it has to be a book of positivity. And my daughter phoned me up and said she was in Edinburgh and could we meet for lunch? And I really didn't want to because I was 2/3 of the way through the writing. But you can't refuse your daughter. So I said, yes, okay, I'll come and have lunch. So I quickly scribbled notes for where I thought the 3 threads were going in the remaining, I think there were like 3 chapters for each thread still to do. So I made a few notes, went and had lunch, came back, and then the next morning I got up and started again. And that I was quite surprised that I was able to pick it up again from where I'd left it, because that was my greatest fear, that I would have lost something. The language just comes. It's not that I give any particular attention to it. I just trust that my creative subconscious is doing something with the language as well. And I think with this book, what I was conscious of were the voices, that I wanted lots of voices, and I wanted a differentiation between the voices. And so that's what I was going for. So Ada Alice Pullen definitely is a sort of Londoner, and Margaret, the maid, has definitely got some Irish in her. And so, yeah, I was probably conscious of that in the way that I'm conscious of other people's voices when I'm in a room and they're talking to me, kind of thing.
Douglas, I wanted you to tell us more about the title, and I'm guessing you'll probably want to read the epigraph in order to do so, but I'll leave that up to you.
Titles come to me. I knew it was going to be about hope. And so as a working title, it was just called Hope. But as I was writing, I was reading these letters from Emily Dickinson. And in one of the letters to Susan Huntington, she had included a poem. In fact, in many of the letters, she'd included poems. But this was a poem that had the line, "Hope never knew horizon." And it leapt out at me as being what this book was about. It was about how hope doesn't have to be realized now, currently, in the moment when you express that hope. It can be realized much further down the line, way into the future. And so much of these three stories is about a kind of future hope. And in an odd way, it's about my future hope too, my personal future hope. And my personal future hope is that long after I'm dead and gone and buried, blue whales will still exist. I hope for that. Long after I'm buried, I hope that people might be reading my books and that my voice might still be in the world. And long after I'm dead, I hope that maybe my books will have an impact somewhere. So these are all very personal hopes, and they inform the book a little bit. But I only kind of realized that after it was written. So I only realized that these individual hopes were very personal to me.
And very much connected to that, I kept thinking about, as I read through the three narratives, was posterity and influence. And sometimes those were exactly the same thing. Sometimes they were a little bit divergent from each other, but they all were, maybe go so far as to say, flew out of hope.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you've just said your own hope for posterity, and I'm willing to guarantee it, Douglas.
Oh, thank you.
All right, people, I told you I'd warn you, and I'm warning you now. All bets are off from here on in. We won't necessarily only be talking about spoilery things, but we're giving ourselves carte blanche to do so. So you have some choices to make. My advice, if you're a person who doesn't care particularly about spoilers, just stick around. If you are, rush out, get the book, read it. Don't rush while reading it, though, and then come back.
I was thinking about how Ada wanted to be recognized as an artist, as a performer, and thinking about the difference between being in a painting, especially one that's going to be hanging in a gentleman's study. She's not only not going to hear what they say about her, but it's not really going to be about her. So that desire for recognition and fame comes up there. But I also like that she thought about, even if the painting was in a public gallery, she wouldn't be recognized. And then later on, she does hang around a painting of herself and listen to what people have to say. And they do talk about the painting. And I love that, because I think that paintings are something that carries on into the future. And I'm really glad that you delved into the model behind that painting, which I did see when I went to the Tate Britain, and it also struck me. Yeah. I had a question about the letters that Emily wrote to Susan. and there's the phrase "love and larks ascending." And I wondered, did that actually come from one of the letters, or was that one of your inventions?
I think that might have been one of my inventions. Scholars are divided as to what the relationship actually was, that it might have just been the way people at that time expressed themselves and that there wasn't anything more than sisterliness between the two of them. And so I didn't want scholars to turn around and say to me, no, you're wrong, if I was writing for the wrong group. So I came up with the idea that Margaret would do all that for me. And so that if a scholar came to me and said, no, there was no such relationship between Susan Huntington and Emily Dickinson, I would say I never actually argued that there was. It was Margaret thought there was. And so Margaret takes all the blame for me, if you like. And I thought I was writing pretty much about Emily Dickinson and Susan Huntington, but it transpired that I was really writing about Margaret and Margaret's hopes. And I had no idea when I started with Margaret, I had no idea that she was going to get married and move away from the Dickinson family. I had no idea what was waiting for her in the future. And so, yeah, that was a bit of an adventure for me to find that out and to discover what was going to happen.
That was a brilliant choice. Yeah, I really like that. But of course, as a reader, I make associations. So I was thinking of the George Meredith poem, Lark Ascending, and the musical piece that I had to go and listen to. But then I thought, but that's not Emily Dickinson. But I can still feel the joy and hope that is in that poem and the music.
Yeah. And that's possibly where I got the words from, because I have no idea where the words come from. And I've been reading for 50 years now. And so there must be so much crammed into my creative subconscious. So it's very possible that the words have come from Meredith or something like that.
I will edit this question out if I misread something or missed something, but I was very curious about, while we're on the topic of Margaret, that when Emily died and then her book of poetry came out, there is reference to the fact that the poems were preserved by Margaret somebody, and yet she had already left her job. So was that intentional? Did I misunderstand something, or was it a different Margaret?
It was a different Margaret. So the Emily Dickinson's household had one Margaret O'Brien, and then they had another Margaret, which I think is Margaret Mayer or something. And so, yeah, just a coincidence that they had two Margarets as maids.
That's fascinating.
I have a question. Emily's dog. She named the dog Carlo for something she saw in the book. And then I was wondering, okay, where does that come from? And I couldn't think of what it is. Did you have something in mind?
I think I must have read somewhere that she had named the dog Carlo after something she'd read in a book. And it maybe even gave me the reference, but it's lost to me now. So I'm sorry, I can't help you with that one.
That's all right.
One of the things that I remember you doing in other books we've read and loved by you is the kind of coincidences, but probably the word resonances is more apt. And in this, it was the things people tucked away in their pockets. Can you talk about that for a little while? I'd love that.
Yeah, I needed Margaret to discover a letter. And so I didn't know this beforehand, but I read somewhere about how letters were sometimes pinned inside pockets. And I thought that was a rather strange thing to do, but then it made sense because you always lose things out of your pockets. And pockets in Victorian times probably weren't that well designed. And so losing things out of pockets was probably something that happened quite a lot. So I have Margaret, who is getting the dresses ready to be washed, and she's going through the pockets in the way that I do when I'm washing my own jeans or something. I have to check the pockets to make sure there's no paper hankies in the pockets, because goodness, if you get a paper hanky in your pocket, then your washing is ruined for days and days afterwards. You're picking bits of paper off. So Margaret is preparing the clothes for washing, and she finds this note pinned inside one of the pockets, and she takes it out. It's not sealed, and she reads it, and she thinks it's a love letter to Susan Huntington from Emily. So yeah, finding out that Victorians did that they pinned they pinned letters inside pockets, just gave me a vehicle for how Margaret was going to find out. I think if you remember that when Susan gets married to Emily's brother Austin, on the day of celebration of the wedding, Emily slips a wee note into Susan's wedding dress pocket, and it falls out because it's not been pinned in, and Margaret has to retrieve it because it not only does it fall out, but it falls onto the floor and out of sight under the furniture. And so Margaret, having seen all this, has to retrieve it and then has to put the letter back in the pocket without being seen. And her fingers, Margaret's fingers, are not anywhere near as nimble as Emily's. Yeah, she has to perform a little bit of magic. In fact, she calls it magic. She had to magic it back into the pocket.
After she'd had quite a gawk at it.
Yes, of course.
And
by that time, she is completely wrapped up in this love story because really she would like a love story of her own, I think.
And then one of the boys that's involved in putting the whale skeleton back together, he literally pockets one of the bones in the tail, or is that right? In the tail, it's the spine of.
And that is actually true. That's not a piece of fiction. That actually happened. And the blue whale skeleton hung up there for 81 years without anyone noticing that there was this tiny little bone missing from the very, very end of its spine.
There's another pocket as well in the other storyline.
Yes.
And it's wishes that are snatched and kept in pockets. I liked that imagery.
That's right.
I think that's what I said earlier about how I hope that the stories resonated off each other, and that they set off like vibrations, like musical strings when you pluck them, and the vibrations don't just vibrate through their own story, but vibrate because they're next to these other stories, that they vibrate into those stories. So I think that's possibly what's happening with all those pockets.
And the cherries
Yeah.
that are joined in pairs.
Yes.
And then in the next chapter, we're on to Ada, and she's talking about taking 2 bites out of the cherries.
Yeah.
So it's just very satisfying.
And I think that happens all the way through. You can find these little things that kind of link the story, so that the stories on one level seem very separate and nothing to do with each other, but they are all to do with hope, and they all have these little resonances or vibrations.
Maybe my last question, although I will not hold myself to that, comes from your epilogue. And 2 things that jumped out at me that I'd like to push them even closer together than they are in your epilogue and see what you have to say about this. One is, it is a work of fiction. So you need to understand, it is a work of fiction, and as such, it runs to a different test of truth from fact. And then on the next page, you very intriguingly say, I can't help but feel that biography is at least a near cousin of fiction. Douglas Bruton, please hold forth on those 2.
I was a great fan in my earlier years of chat shows. I watched lots of chat shows, and I can't remember the actor that I'm going to make reference to here, but this actor, I saw him right at the very start of his career, and he was asked to tell a story, an anecdote to do with some film he just made, and he was pretty clumsy in the way that he told it. And I heard him about 4 years later asked almost the same question, and this time when he told the story, he was a master raconteur. The story had altered slightly, but it was more fully a story, and it was well told. And I thought, well, we all do that. We all prune our stories and learn better ways to tell them, or we respond to the audience. So if the audience laugh at a particular bit, then we make sure that we've got that bit in the next time we tell it, or we even push it a little bit more next time we tell it and get a bigger laugh. And so, yeah, I think I was just talking about this with my wife in the garden, and that we all, when we're telling our own life stories, we all fill in the spaces and make them into stories. And the simple act of making it into a story turns it into a fiction and moves it a step away from cold truth into something that's a bit more dancing and singing and laughing. And I would say that's probably, even if you're taking any kind of biography, autobiography or biography, that basically you won't know everything if you're writing this down. And so you will fill in the gaps, or you'll put something in to make it make sense or something. So yeah, I'm very wary of reading memoir and biography. In fact, I have just read the most wonderful memoir. It's called All of Us Atoms, and it's by someone called Holly Davidson. And I don't read memoirs as a rule, generally, but I picked this up because it had a really good review. And I would say if you read this, you would think you were reading fiction, because the language is so beautiful. It's so beautifully written and so wonderfully written. And it has the feel of fiction, even though it's real. So yeah, I'm very wary of biographies and very wary of memoirs and things that purport to be truth. But also I'm of an age that when I kind of look back at my own life and my own memories, they've shifted a little bit and they've stepped a little bit away from truth. They're honest when I tell them, and there may be even a few facts in there, but somehow they've shifted a little bit and they're not quite as truthful as one wants from truth or expects from truth.
Wow, I love how you put that. But to me, I think that truth is not the same as facts in the sense of emotional truth. Yeah. In the very first chapter, when we meet Ned, who discovers the whale, it's in the voice, that particular chapter is in the voice of one of his girlfriends. And she talks about how he took this story and it grew arms and legs and went running crazy down the street. Yeah. I love that.
And what I love is that I saw Lindy writing down the title and author of that memoir, Douglas. She will have it read by next weekend. I'm willing to bet money if she can get her hands on it that quickly.
Well, I'm trying to push it into as many hands as possible because I absolutely loved it. Thought that the writing was just incredibly beautiful.
This has been a very full, vibrant and vibrating conversation, so I think we've done it up good. Douglas, what are you working on now?
So I'm in a bit of a dip at the moment where I'm between projects. I've written 2 projects this year. So in February, I had a book published called Woman in Blue, and I've written not a sequel, but a companion piece to that. And it starts with the words, "It begins with a lie." And if you read Woman in Blue, you'll understand that one of the central characters is called Lika, and the first 3 letters of her name is Lie. So it begins with a lie. It's all about Lika and about how many untruths she told in that first book that I wrote. But I've also just put the finishing touches to a book that is quite different from anything else that I've had published. I went in 2005 or 6, I went to Peru. And I went as part of a group to do some charity work. There was a particular social problem at that time in Peru where families, they had very big families and they were too big for everyone to be fed. And so the parents would eventually arrive at a terrible decision where they would have to lose one of the children. And so they would take one of the boys, the oldest boy usually, and they would travel far away to another city, and they would tell the boy to wait in the marketplace. It would be a busy place, and then they would get the bus home and leave the boy there, and the boy would have to fend for himself. And it was such an awful situation that there were no social services at that time in Peru. The police thought the boys must be evil because their parents had left them, and so they had no sympathy for them. So it was a terrible situation. And this charity called the Vine Trust had set up rescue centers in various parts of Peru, and I went over to help in one place to make mud bricks so that they could build dormitories and they could build schools and health centers and so on for these boys to be housed in. So I wanted to do something with that as a piece of writing. And the place where we went to was in full view of a mountain called Huascaran. And Huascaran, it's an incredible mountain. You're in such hot temperatures, and yet this is a snow-capped mountain. And in 1970, I think it was, the for some strange reason, we don't fully understand why. It might have been to do with French nuclear tests in the Pacific, but a piece of the mountain, a gigantic piece of the mountain, sloughed off and descended into the valley and gaining speed and picking up debris as it went. And it was a kind of steam train of ice and snow and mud, and it tore through the valley, 8 miles along the valley, and tore through it. And it buried one town completely. We don't have an exact figure of how many died in the disaster, but the figure of 70,000 is not an unreasonable estimate. And so I wanted to write something about that too. So I've written about a man who thinks he's going to be writing you a love story, and he ends up writing about this catastrophe from memory. Because if you go to the town that was buried is called Yungay, and where Yungay was, it's now a memorial garden, and you've got rusting school buses sticking out of the baked hard mud, and you've got church fronts still standing, but everything else is just gone. And so this narrator goes to visit this memorial garden, and he has an experience where he falls to the ground, and his ear is pressed to the ground, and he hears the dead talking to him, and he recounts some of the stories that they've told. He realizes by the end that he's not writing the kind of love story he thought he was writing. He's writing a much more human love story to do with loving the people that have gone. And yeah, so I've just finished that.
And my body is starting to hum with the resonances of what we just read, with people putting their ear up to things and how one coaxes out and keeps hope alive. Yes, you are a hope whisperer, Douglas.
Oh,
What an exquisite conversation. I cannot recommend Hope Never Knew Horizon highly enough. It was an extremely hopeful read in the most literary, non-sentimental way possible. Thank you so much for your time, Douglas.
Thank you so much, Shawn. Thank you, Lindy. I'm so glad that you liked the book.